Dr. G, Andy, how you doing, guys?
Doing great.
All
awesome. Let's kick this off today. But before we get going, I want to introduce both of you to our listeners, especially if we have new listeners here. Dr. G is a renowned board-certified chiropractic neurologist dedicated to holistic health. He is one of America's leading experts in lifelong optimized living, having trained thousands of clients and practitioners within his training program, and he has over 800,000 Instagram followers. Andry Cieply is a nutrition expert and head coach at Co-Movement Gym. He has over 12 years experience training clients. Our topic this week is about a man, Angus Barbary from Scotland, who went 382 days without eating, and he lost 276 pounds in the process. So some of you listening today may have heard this story. I think it was a few years back there. Quite a ways back, but I'm fascinated at how this is even possible. So I brought on both of you experts to sort of dive into the behind the scenes on, what's going on with this. The Co-Movement Gym podcast is sponsored by Native Path Supplements, Lombardi Chiropractic, and A Dog's Day Out Doggy Daycare. Mention this podcast or use the promo code in the episode description for a nice discount on us. Andy, can you kick us off here and just give our listeners like a 101 version of this story here?
Yeah, just really briefly. I mean, you pretty much summarized it there. It's just a guy who was very obese, very overweight, and he did this for the purposes of losing weight. He wanted to get down to about 180 pounds, which he considered his ideal weight. And so for, like you said, 382 days, over a year, he took in nothing but water, some black coffee, some tea, and then some vitamin supplements that his doctors were giving him. He was being monitored the whole time. But he took in no calories, no solid food, no liquid food. And over that year plus, he lost all that weight and got down to 180 pounds and eventually stopped the fast, which boggles people's minds. How can you go that long without calories?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Dr. G, jump in here. Like, how is that possible? How does he not go crazy from hunger, weakness? How can you explain how the body even makes that possible?
Well, certainly I'll go down that path. I'll answer those questions, but I do have a question for you, Andy. What year was that?
I think it was in the 1960s. I don't remember exactly what year, 64, 65 maybe.
Was there any long-term follow-up?
No, not as far as I know. We always hear the story of just the 382 days, but I don't know what happened to him 6 months later, a year later, 10 years later.
I was wondering the same thing. Like, I didn't read that there was a follow-up either, but like, did he gain it back? Did he maintain it? Like, I don't know, I would be very interested to see what happened.
Well, it really goes to the, for the listeners, especially who are looking to lose weight, the way in which you lose weight may not be the way in which you keep it off. And we know this to be true, from the television show, The Biggest Loser, where, they basically just calorie restrict. You eat 600 calories a day, you work out 6 hours a day, and it's a race to the bottom. And then we know that on the 2-year follow-up, virtually, 100% of the contestants and the winners from that show gained all of their weight back and then some. So that would be my expectation from this story. But let's first talk about, the physiology of what happened. Andy, do you agree with that? Do you agree with what I just said?
Yeah, and we've seen that from the Biggest Loser contestants specifically, who some of the past winners have come back 6 months or a year after the show and talked to the media, and they've gained all the weight back that they lost on the show. And I think it just kind of goes to show that when you restrict that much, it has a profound effect on your metabolism, to the point that when you start eating again, you are not going to do as well with that caloric intake as you would have prior.
Yeah, the assumption is that they're just weak people and they just go back to the life that got them into this mess to begin with. And we know that to absolutely not be true. So I do want to touch on that. So let's go back to Angus and what happens when we do a fast. So Josh, you asked, wouldn't he feel massive amounts of hunger and fatigue and maybe pass out and all of those things? And that could be true. However, that usually is true in the first 10 days, right? When you're used to feeding yourself a certain way, and in his case, probably overfeeding himself, where you get your energy from is based on what you've been doing. And when you alter that, the body has to have a time in which it's going to adapt. And that adaptation period for many people is 7 to 14 days, where you start getting all the classic, feelings of hunger and energy depletion and other types of problems. But then your body kicks in, right? There's genetics. We're human. We, like to believe that we've been on this planet for a long time, and there are people who had to adapt to periods of lack and as well as abundance, and the body can do that. And what happens when you're fasting is, well, especially when you're that big, you start to catabolize your own body to use for energy and fuel. And body fat is the way we do that. We can only store so much carbohydrate. Doesn't matter how much you eat. Your liver can only hold about 400 calories. Your muscles can only hold about 1,600 calories. So let's just say you got 2,000 calories, which is really just one day for most people, one day of energy. But because we can store an endless amount of fat, hundreds, if not, well, in this case, millions of calories, you would then just mobilize the body fat and use that for your fuel. When you do that, when you release fat from your fat cells, you send it to the liver and it converts the fatty acids into ketones. That puts you into what we call ketosis. And ketosis is a very efficient use of energy. And amazing things happen when you go into ketosis, because ketosis is muscle preserving. It's muscle preserving, meaning you're less likely, or you'll break down muscle more slowly while you're in ketosis. So this is important, seen also in cancer patients who are trying to get into ketosis, because the biggest problem with cancer when your health really declines is cachexia. And that means you just catabolize your muscles. And that's when cancer patients get real small, right? It's because they're just burning through their muscle. And when you're in ketosis, you would slow that down. So in Angus's case, he started to mobilize his body fat, and his body fat, because of the millions and millions of calories he had available, lasted him that entire year. He did have protein loss. There's no question about it. It was just slowed down by being in ketosis. And again, depending on his size, he probably had enough to get through that year. The problem with losing protein or losing muscle mass is that muscle mass is very energy expensive. And once you start eating again, your caloric needs are far less to maintain whatever weight you're at. Let's say his target was 180. His caloric needs are far less than what they were to maintain 400. So even though he didn't go back to eating the way he, that caused him to get to become obese, he probably gained his weight back just from increasing his diet, just by 400 or 500 calories. You will gain your weight back.
Wow.
Dr. G, when you say that ketosis is muscle preserving, the mechanism there, is it basically just that the reason we might catabolize muscle is often to turn it into glucose, but when we're in ketosis, there's less of a requirement for glucose because we can use the ketones for energy instead. Is that mainly why ketosis is muscle preserving?
Well, think about it. The reason somebody would be in significant ketosis is during a period of lack. So let's just put ourselves back into, humans coming out of the ice age. If you were to go a couple of weeks, between kills, right? So it's wintertime, you're somewhere in North America, There's really no vegetation to eat. You're dependent on the next squirrel or the next deer that you catch. And, there could be a significant amount of time in which, what if it's 2 weeks before you have your next meal? Well, in that case, if hunger made you lethargic and have no energy, we would have never survived. As a matter of fact, ketosis is a higher level of energy, higher level of mental acuity. Less sleep is needed because you need to be awake and strong enough for your next kill. So it makes survival sense to say that if I'm in ketosis, I'm looking for food. If I'm looking for food, I better be fast, and I better be strong, and I better be awake and energized. And that's what happens with ketosis. So it's going to preserve muscle from a survival standpoint, because remember, if you're going to turn muscle into fuel, that's kind of like saying, I heat my house with a fireplace and I'm going to use my $10,000 dining room table to heat the house. It's catabolizing what has the greatest value.
Yeah.
You would never do that. You would rather put firewood into the fireplace than your furniture. So think about your muscles as very expensive, hard to attain organs that you need to survive. So that's the reason. Now, the exact mechanism of why that happens, it has to do with AMPK and mTOR and other genetic biochemical processes, which are not at my fingertips,
Right.
But
Okay.
I think that's the premise.
Yeah, makes perfect evolutionary sense. I love it. And when anything in physiology makes good evolutionary sense, you have a good indication that you're on the right track.
So one of the questions I have, and Dr. G, that was eloquently put, fascinating from my perspective. How about electrolytes? I know that I've done a variety of different kinds of fasts, and one of the first ones I did years ago, it was called the Swiss Detox. It was an older school fasting protocol. I did it probably 15 years ago. And the first few days I had taken in little to no sodium. It was like a raw bone broth. It was pretty brutal. It was good for maybe detoxing, I guess, and giving my digestion some rest. But I was really lethargic until I added salt, specifically salt, but electrolytes. And then I perked right up. I had no calories from that. But why is electrolytes so important to feeling better while fasting?
Remember the movie from the 80s, Gandhi?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the significant things that happened in that movie, which mimics, of course, real life, is they went to the sea to harvest salt, right? Because, salt to humans is incredibly important. Yet all the advice is stay away from salt. Stay away from salt. It's going to kill you. It's going to make your blood pressure. Well, when you have a more indigenous type of a diet, which means a less refined foods, lower carbohydrate type of diet, you release less insulin. And insulin, when you have less insulin, you're going to release more sodium into your kidneys to be excreted. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you have higher insulin release on a daily basis, you hold on to your sodium. So we need less salt on the standard American diet. But if you go into a fasting state, or if you're going to do a no carbohydrate, low carbohydrate diet, your insulin release is going to be very low. You're going to release a lot of salt. And, humans need salt. And we went to great lengths, in human history to make sure we didn't run out of salt. So that's the reason that you crave the salt, or that it affected your energy, because you remember electrolytes, right? It's what gives us our electrical charge. You can't contract a muscle. You can't think a thought. You can't fire a nerve without an electrical impulse. And that electrical impulse occurs across membranes. And what gives us that difference in charge across a membrane is going to be the electrolytes: chloride, magnesium, potassium, calcium, CO2, bicarbonate. All of these things have an electric charge. So that allows us to function. If you're deficient in those electrolytes, then it makes sense that those systems are not going to work very well.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it was when I had taken the electrolytes in, it was like I was a renewed person. Native Path has been a podcast sponsor of ours since day one, and it's because our clients feel amazing using their supplements. While a lot of products on the market today contain useless fillers and incorrect dosages, Native Path holds to a higher standard. Native Path's ingredients are sourced from only the highest quality, properly combined nutrients, all while being offered at competitive prices. Use code COMO15, that's COMO 15 at checkout, and receive 15% off each order. Lombardi Chiropractic has been Co-Movement's trusted chiropractor for the last 14 years. They have worked with hundreds of our clients, and I can confidently say they have the most knowledgeable and holistic approach to care that I have ever seen. Whether you suffer from migraines, low energy, nagging pain, or just simply want to improve your overall health, I highly recommend contacting the team at Lombardi Chiropractic. Mention the Co-Movement Gym podcast and receive 50% off your initial consultation and x-rays. Here at Co-Movement, we put a lot of energy into helping you become happy, healthy, and strong. But we're not the only ones needing a good workout. That's why a dog's day out is the best place in Central New York for your pet to spend their day. Your dog will be as happy and healthy as you when you let them run, play, and socialize instead of just sitting on the couch waiting for you to come home. Give your dog the active day out that they deserve. Mention this podcast and get a free day of doggy daycare at a dog's day out. Yeah, so I just want to be clear, too, for people listening, and they might be getting all excited about, starving themselves for a year. Like, we're not recommending following Angus's protocol. We're not putting the Co-Movement stamp on that. We're just diving into the topic, which leads me to a question. I'm very curious on both of your thoughts with this. I'm sure most people saw this article come out. I think it was this year, but it was an article, it was a study. It said 24,000 Americans over 40 found that those who ate one meal per day were 30% more likely to die from any cause in 15 years than those who ate 3 meals. And the title of the article is something about like intermittent fasting can cause early death, right? Or 15% higher chances of early death. Did you guys see that article? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I vaguely remember that. Maybe that was earlier this year, right?
Yeah, it was. And the reason I want to talk about this is because I got quite a few text messages and a few emails from clients, former clients, family members, and some of them were like really concerned. I'd walk them slowly back off the edge of the cliff. But I want to hear from both of you. What was that about? I have my thoughts, and I'll share those at the end here. But what was going on with those findings?
Well, we might have to ask Dr. G about this because Dr. G, you may have actually seen that study. I'm not sure. I don't recall. Was it a study or an article? You said it was a study that they were referencing in the article, but I don't know the details about that or how well it was conducted. Dr. G, do you know any more details about that?
Look, these types of studies come from nutritional epidemiology. Nutritional epidemiology is dependent on food frequency questionnaires that people fill out. And it's very well known among very impressive researchers that food frequency questionnaires are not worth the paper they're written on. And this is why whenever I post an article that is based on nutritional epidemiology, the reason I post it is usually it's going against conventional wisdom, right? The ones that, meat cause cancer is conventional wisdom. So anything that's published that says meat doesn't cause cancer is what I like to post. Not because I think it's true, but because you could use nutritional epidemiology to say whatever the hell you want. And I sound a little cynical. I sound a little bitter because I am. People are, first of all, does it pass the smell test? Eating twice a day. Think about who we are as humans. Really? Are we genetically supposed to have a refrigerator and a pantry full of food to allow us to have breakfast, lunch, dinner? When in human history was that something, that created longevity? If you only eat 2 meals a day and you do so in 8 to 10 hours instead of over 12 to 14 hours, what has to be in place? Only 0.0001% of human history can people even do that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You wake up to a refrigerator and a pantry full of food. You live in a world of abundance. Virtually anything that's ever been called food in the history of the planet is at your fingertips, super cheap, anytime you want it if you live in the Western world. That level of abundance is causing our problems, and I don't need a food frequency questionnaire to prove that to me. It's just kind of obvious. Now, so I don't put a lot of stock in those types of studies. Now, if we're going to talk about fasting as a strategy for weight loss, well, calorie deficiency is how you lose weight. It's not how you keep the weight off. So we should have that distinction, and I'm happy to have a conversation about how to lose weight and then what has to change in order to keep it off, because 99% of the time you're going to gain it back. And it's not like I have all the answers. Just one more point about nutritional epidemiology, if I could. Look, we are humans and we're omnivores and we can adapt to different environments. We are 99.9997% genetically identical to each other, but there's enough variation genetically in all of us to say that there is no one way of doing things, that there's probably, what will work for you, not just psychologically based on your culture and geography and all that stuff, but what will work for you genetically is different. That this is the problem I have with, taking 10,000 people with, cholesterol above a certain number, giving them all medication, taking the average of the outcomes and saying this is good for everybody because the average did this. Well, if you're talking about the average, well, then why don't we just make clothing size for the average? And then the people in the NBA have to walk around looking like freaks, right? There are people who don't fit into the average. And this is where personalized nutrition and personalized fitness is becoming more and more important. And in the medical profession, they're talking about personalized medicine. That's not my field. But yeah, I think things should be more personalized, and looking at studies like this that just rely on these massive questionnaires that are totally unreliable is a waste of time.
Oh, that's great. That was so well put, all of it. Yeah, and I agree. Like I said earlier, if your if your analysis of something doesn't fit with the evolutionary perspective, then it probably doesn't make sense. And as Dr. G said, we didn't have access to food 24 hours a day through 99.99% of our history. And yet we did perfectly fine as a species. And clearly, that indicates that we may not need to eat 5 meals a day to be healthy or for longevity. And you have those epidemiological studies. Those food frequency and food questionnaires are so notoriously unreliable. Most people can't remember what they had this morning for breakfast or, yesterday for any of their meals, let alone you're asking them to fill out this questionnaire about what they've eaten in the last 6 months and estimate the amount of calories they've eaten. And then there's questions like, do you eat meat? Well, someone eats, farm-raised steak and they check yes. Someone else eats, a McDonald's burger with a shake and fries and they check yes. And so, to Dr. Keith's point, those epidemiological studies are they're interesting and they can help you form a hypothesis, but you really can't draw any conclusions from them at all. It's a total waste to even try to do that. And I'm guessing, Josh, that study that you referenced is an epidemiological study.
Yeah, and Andy, it's funny what you just said. It's what I had wrote down here. Like, what were the control factors, right, for like that 1 meal a day versus the 3 meals a day? What was their health going into that, right? Like, there were so many unknown variables, let alone just
what
the
does that
human...
1 meal a day?
Yeah,
what does that 1 meal a day consist of?
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
That's
and
big.
Well, and the other thing too is what was their health going into the so-called study, right? Like, there's just so many facts. They're so individualized that it's not. I didn't even bat an eye at it, but I just didn't know how to answer some of these messages from people that were like, "Oh, you guys are big fans of fasting," and I'm like, "I'm gonna die."
Basically, the long and the short of it, Josh, is that study allowed for journalists to create a sensational headline that got clicks, and that's about it.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, that's good to know. All right. So,
I don't know if you guys remember what documentary this was, but they were trying to say, being vegan is far healthier than not being vegan, and they showed
Game Changers, probably.
Yeah, it could have been that. But the evidence they were using, or the diet of the person who was not the vegan, like they showed him like how often he eats Kentucky Fried Chicken or something, and just take fried chicken, let's just forget the oils that it's fried in and all that stuff. What is fried chicken? It's basically fried bread with some chicken in the middle.
Yeah.
It is not necessarily indicative of a healthy diet that is an omnivore's diet or a paleo style diet. So there are healthy vegan diets and incredibly unhealthy vegan diets.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also incredibly healthy carnivore or paleo style diets and incredibly unhealthy ones. So, that distinction is rarely made. Usually the researchers are trying to prove a point that they already have.
Yeah.
And again, I hate to be cynical. I'd like to think better of our researchers. There are people who are looking for truth, and science is not a pursuit of truth as much as it's a pursuit of getting as close as possible to a probability you could predict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's generating models that accurately predict reality. Right. That allow you to predict reality. Yeah.
And Andy, that was a good point too. I didn't think about this so much, but the clickbait, right? Like the one bold headline put out by, maybe a more popular media source that just goes like wildfire, and millions of people are sharing it, and but no one's diving deeper, like us here. So they're making assumptions based on a random headline. So I guess here, yeah. So there's one more topic I want to hit here, maybe before we wrap this up. Is there any? Do you guys want to get into it all, like some specific fasting protocols that popular protocols that may or may not be worth clients trying? We could say for weight loss. And then Andy, I know you and I last time, privately had a conversation about fasting with like athletes or not fasting and sort of some of that. It's very interesting to me what we talked about with that. So we don't have to spend too much time on it, but yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Well, yeah, more generally, to wrap all those topics together, what I wanted to talk about that we didn't get to last time was your guys' thoughts on if you recommend fasting, if you find it beneficial for most people or some people, not all people, like which populations. Because something that I've noticed, I was something of a fasting and intermittent fasting zealot when this started to become really popular, maybe about 20, 15 years ago. And all the mechanisms were starting to be described, and all these benefits, autophagy, AMPK activation, obviously the weight loss stuff, perhaps improving insulin sensitivity, on and on and on. We were flooded with a whole deluge of pro-fasting content, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago. And I got really into it, and I was starting to recommend it to everybody. I was pretty convinced that this was a great thing that everyone should do. Whether, some people long-term fasting or at least intermittent fasting for everybody. But something I've noticed in the last probably 3 to 5 years is a lot of popular nutrition experts, I'll say, are starting to turn back on fasting a little bit. You've got, like, for example, Peter Attia, who used to do quarterly fasts it's like a 3-day fast every quarter. And he has recently said that he stopped doing that because he's concerned about the potential for muscle loss. And other ones have said that they used to do 16-8 intermittent fasting every single day, and they've kind of dropped that and gone to a more standard eating window. So there seems to be a bit of a trend among a lot of the influencers, I guess I'll say, and experts in this field that a lot of people might follow online, where they're not finding as much benefit to fasting. Perhaps they're being convinced by some recent research that maybe it's not as magical as we thought 15 or 20 years ago. So I kind of wanted to get, maybe Dr. G, your opinion on it. I don't know if you've seen that trend, or if you think, how much benefit do you think there is to fasting, and who should do it, who shouldn't? Is there a should and shouldn't here? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to look at this is, what are your short-term goals? What are your long-term goals?
Okay.
What are you trying to solve? Having a distinction between fasting and time-restricted eating is important as well. 16 and 8 is really not fasting. I mean, that actually seems very natural.
That's pretty standard, yeah.
Pretty standard, or 14 and 10.
Yeah.
I think what might be unnatural is eating over 14 hours. And the reason I say that is, again, if we just try to use common sense and say, who were we before refrigerators, pantries, and electricity? That food involved work. Food involved, it wasn't just at arm's reach. And it's probably makes sense that you wouldn't have eaten over 12 hours a day. All right. So with that being said, time restriction is not a bad practice. Again, even if we went back to 1750 and you're John Adams, you're an attorney in Boston, and you woke up in the middle of the night and you're kind of hungry. What would you'd just go back to sleep?
Yeah.
But now you get up and you eat an apple or there's just it's all at arm's reach. Now, what is fasting? I think fasting is something that is over 24 hours. So from a time restriction standpoint, it's fine, but it's really just a great tool for two things. One is to hormonally regulate hunger. It's, people find fasting easy because it doesn't require, after a certain number of days, it doesn't require a whole lot of willpower. So it's a good lever to pull. And you mentioned Peter Attia, and he likes to use levers to pull for improving your metabolic health, not weight loss. Weight loss implies you're improving your metabolic health. In order, he says time restriction is one lever, calorie restriction is another lever, and then macronutrient restriction is another lever. And anything that makes it easier for you to not be out of energy balance, and most people with these challenges are out of energy balance. They're consuming more energy than they're expending. And to be in energy balance without feeling like you're pushing away from a table still hungry and using a massive amount of willpower is what people are pursuing. Just going into energy balance, if you have severe problems, is not enough. I think you have to go into energy deficit. And that's where fasting can be helpful. And that's where Angus's story started. Longer term, so Peter Attia, you mentioned, again, not only is he turning back on what he used to do, well, he used to do that a number of years ago. And now he's over 50. And there is, one thing we could say about, who we are from an evolutionary standpoint, is we don't have an understanding of evolution as it relates to longevity.
Right.
So decisions we make over a certain age shouldn't be the same decisions you would make when you're 25 or 30 years old or younger. So I think it's a little bit more nuanced. You could use those levers to improve your metabolic health, reach your goals. But now, once you've reached those goals, what do you do? And you know, goes to what I think I had said initially. The way you lose the weight or improve your metabolic health isn't the way you keep it off or the way you keep your metabolic health. Excessive fasting over a long period of time is probably going to result in protein deficit and inactivity. You know, your body is going to get used to the fact that it costs you X number of calories to be, you know, as active as you are at 220 pounds. You need far less calories to be, you know, to be 180 pounds. So what it takes to get from 220 to 180, and then, you know, it's not like you just go back to the way things were, because then you're going to go back to the way things were. What you have to do then is say, all right, how much activity am I getting? You know, when you're in a calorie deficit and you think you're working out and keeping your energy high, you're naturally going to just fidget less. You're going to sleep more. The body has a very innate way of protecting itself. So, yeah, you might go to the gym more, but you might be not expending calories because you're in a deficit, and your body recognizes that, and it will burn less energy in other ways. That makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And I really appreciate that you keep talking about, you brought up the importance of an energy deficit many times when it comes to fat loss, because, you know, something we saw again, maybe a decade or more ago, was a lot of people talking about how calories actually don't matter. And sometimes it was the fasting and intermittent fasting group that was like, you know what, you can eat all you want to. As long as you're eating in a 4-hour window, calories don't matter. That's a thing of the past. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize now that actually the amount of energy you're consuming really does matter. You're not going to lose body fat or lose weight if you're in a calorie surplus, an energy surplus. And you know, my view with intermittent fasting, calorie restriction, fasting in general, this is a great tool for people who it works for. You know, because some people find that it fits their lifestyle to eat 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day, and that's an easier way for them to achieve that energy deficit that they need to lose weight. Other people find that it feels too restrictive and they don't enjoy it at all, or they're trying to eat in a little 4-hour window, and when they get there, they're so excited for that window that they just stuff themselves with more food than they would have normally taken in a regular day anyway, and now it's not working for them. So, you know, to Dr. G's point earlier, where he said that there is, even though we're 99% similar, there is that little bit of difference between us. Some people, fasting is a great tool for, and it's going to work. It's going to fit their lifestyle, and it's going to feel less restrictive and an easier way to get into that energy deficit. And some people, it's not. So I'm not against intermittent fasting or fasting in general as a tool to lose, or as a way to lose weight. It's just a matter of, does it work for you or does it not work for you? And people need to experiment themselves to find out if they want to do that.
I think a perfect example of genetic variation are people who live the standard American lifestyle, meaning lack of exercise, poor food choices, and they look like you, Andy. They're skinny, right? They don't have the ability to put on weight. And I think in that population, you'll see more visceral fat from a percentage standpoint, which is the dangerous fat, and far less subcutaneous fat, because genetically they're just not going to put on subcutaneous fat. And the assumption is they're thin and they're healthy, and actually they're very unhealthy. Whereas vice versa, you could have a Pacific Islander who has an incredible ability to store subcutaneous fat, which is not unhealthy.
Right.
And if they are in energy balance and in, have a physically fit life, they can almost look obese and have hardly any visceral fat. And therefore they're in far better shape.
Yeah, I think in the nutrition literature, they refer to those people as like MHO, the metabolically healthy obese.
Yeah.
And that's perfectly possible. You've got plenty of healthy, non-diseased subcutaneous fat that's doing its thing and functioning exactly as it should. And your visceral and fat levels are very low. You don't have any ectopic fat. And all your blood levels check out and everything. And you're perfectly healthy despite carrying what might look like an unhealthy amount of subcutaneous fat to people who don't know better.
And it's interesting. Like I said, Pacific Islanders for a very specific reason, because in the Pacific, the distance between islands is so massive that if you ventured off to get from one island to another, the people who survived that trip were the ones who had subcutaneous fat to feed off of, the way Angus did, to sustain long periods of fasting. And therefore, genetically, they're really good at storing subcutaneous fat. Whereas
There's an evolutionary advantage.
Correct. Correct. That's where the genetic differences are in humans based on the environment in which our ancestors evolved. A great example, because a lot of times people get their genetic test and they say, oh, I have a genetic defect, because they, ran a panel of single nucleotide polymorphisms. And a single nucleotide polymorphism is not a measure of genetic defect as much as it's a measure of genetic variant. And, so people with methylation variants, there's a reason for it. Somewhere in your ancestral line, there was a survival reason why you have that genetic SNP. So there's a common disorder of iron storage called hemochromatosis, which really it's a storage of iron problem. You store massive amounts of iron. Well, whenever we have an infection, the body in all of us innately stores iron away as a unusable form, a storage form called ferritin. And that's so the bacteria or the virus that infected you cannot utilize your iron to their benefit. That's a normal innate response. Okay. Now, in Europe, in the Middle Ages, there was the plague, which took out 25% of the continent. So the people with this genetic variant of storing a lot of iron survived the plague. And therefore the genetically the number of people that would procreate after the plague were people with hemochromatosis. And, we see it all the time. Now, that gave you genetic survivability in the short run to deal with with an infection. But in the long term, now that we're living to 70, 80, 90 years old, all that iron is being dumped in your brain and your liver, and it causes cirrhosis, and it causes oxidative, iron will rust. So it causes health problems in the elderly or as you get older. But that wasn't evolutionary. From an evolutionary standpoint, the purpose is to live until you can make babies, not to live until you're 90 years old. Right? So evolutionary pressures are to survive through your childbearing years. After that, it's all a bonus.
Yeah.
From an evolutionary perspective.
It's funny.
Wow.
I've talked about this before with you guys, but like that show alone, the contestants that go in skinny, regardless of their skill set, generally don't make it the farthest. But the people that go in with the aesthetic of looking at them as like they're not in shape or healthy, right? Those are just, judgments or observations that may not be accurate. They last the longest. And, they've got more of the reserve on them. And I'm fascinated by that. Like, there's been guys that are like Delta Force and, Ranger, like they've got the whole resume of being like the baddest ass survivor, but they're 7% body fat and they don't get any food for the first 10 days hardly. And then they eat a rabbit here and there. And by 21 days, they're like, just don't want to get out of their sleeping bag. And it's like a slow death. And then they're done. And then you've got the guy 2-3 miles down the coast that, came in with, subcutaneous fat and, doesn't run or exercise. And he has the same skill set as, let's say, that Ranger. But he's just got a lot more energy reserve to pull off. And they last a lot longer. So it's just a cool observation. We've watched a lot of those seasons and just like the repeating themes, right? Like animal fat, protein, more subcutaneous fat. They last longer. Like, there's just reoccurring themes. And what Andy had said earlier, like if it doesn't sort of follow evolutionary history, you got to question it. But like that does, and it proves even in the modern day, when you strip us down to the bare bones, like in the show, what do we innately crave and need to survive? And that's it, So it's just a neat observation. One question I have before we wrap this up, we have a client, let's say, they've been eating low calorie, 800,000 calories a day, for a long time, and they're 40, 50 pounds overweight, and they cannot lose weight even on that low of a calorie diet. Like, what's going on? This is not uncommon. I've seen a lot of food journals. We've talked to, a lot of people that this is the situation. And so where's that person falling? Because we all agree that a calorie deficit leads to weight loss. But what's happening with these kinds of people? Like, and I'm clumping them all as one group, but let's use my generic example as the prototype.
Yeah, Dr. G has already mentioned that as you lower your daily caloric intake over weeks and weeks and months, your metabolism is going to lower to match that intake. It's just like finances. If I'm making less money over weeks and weeks and months, I'm going to be spending less money at the stores because I don't have it to spend.
Gotcha.
And you can get to that point where you have been eating, like we've seen in food journals, 600 or 800 calories a day, for a person that we would expect to be eating 2,000, calories per day. And they've been doing this 600, 800 calories per day for years. And now their metabolism is very slow. And at that point, they're going to have a very difficult time losing weight because you can't restrict calories further than that. They can't go to 500 calories and then 400 and 300. You're going to end up so malnourished, things are going to shut down in your body. I think usually the best strategy with somebody like this is to get them to start consuming more calories and get their metabolism to rise accordingly following that. And there might even be some initial weight gain there. But if we can get them in the gym, working out as they're able, and get them to slowly increase their calories, people do, I think they call this reverse dieting. Our friend Bob is a big fan of that, but reverse dieting is basically this. It's trying to slowly increase the amount of calories that you're taking in over time. So you can get that person who's eating 600 or 800 calories back up to 2,000. You wouldn't do that in a week. You might add 100 calories a week or every 2 weeks or something, or until they get back up to where they should be, a good healthy amount of food. And hopefully their metabolism is rising along with that, to the point where now they can sustain, they have energy balance at 2,000 calories instead of energy balance at 600. And they're going to feel a lot better if they can get to that point.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a great explanation, Andy.
Well, one thing though, I'd love, Dr. G wants to chime in. I'd love Dr. G to also, if you have any insight into this, someone who has been taking in like 600 or 800 calories for a long period of time, and we want to perhaps do this reverse dieting strategy with them. I'm always curious, does that person let's say they've been taking in 800 calories a day for 10 years, are there long-term effects of that are somewhat irreversible or harder to reverse. I don't know, hormonal changes or anything like that, where when they do the reverse dieting, if they choose to go that route, maybe you think there's a better way, they're going to run into roadblocks because of some long-term damage they've done from this low-calorie lifestyle. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just depends on the person that we're talking about and what their health profile is. Just assume they're not unhealthy or sick or they don't have any defects, to speak of. What usually happens is, again, I'm just going to use round numbers. 2,500 calories allowed you to sustain being overweight at 250 pounds. And then you said, I've had enough of being 250 pounds. I want to be 180 pounds, or let's just make it 200. I want to lose 50 pounds. So if 2,500 calories for years is what kept you at 250, that means you got to go to a deficit. All right, so I'm going to go down to 2,000 calories. That's a 500 calorie deficit. You lose weight. You lose weight, you lose weight, you lose weight. And let's just say you get to 200 pounds at 2,000 calories. You no longer lose weight. Well, I didn't reach my goal. So I have to go into a further deficit. Go down to 1,750. Well, let's just make it 1,500. So now I'm losing weight. I hit 180. That's my goal. I don't look the way I like. So you know what? I'll shoot for another 10. And you go into a further deficit. And then you hit some kind of equilibrium. You're not going to just keep losing weight. So now you're at, a low amount of, let's just say you went to 1,000 calories. You're now 170 pounds or 150 pounds. And you start, and you're only at 1,000 calories. Now you started at 2,500 calories. So you say, all right, you know what? I'm going to start eating more like a human being and stop always dieting. And I'm just going to I'm going to go up to 1,500. It's nowhere near where I was. Well, then you start gaining weight because now you're in a surplus. Even though you're still low, relatively speaking, you're at a surplus. So that's the mechanism. Now, if you become a chronic dieter and you get down to 800 calories, which is ridiculous, you're clearly not even getting enough protein. And, sustained weight loss occurs under the squat rack. And that means you need energy expensive tissue, and that only comes in the form of muscle, which is how you lose, calorie restriction or calorie deficit is how you lose muscle. And if you want to reverse this, I think you're correct, but don't pay too much attention to calories as much as pay attention to grams of protein.
Yeah.
Grams of protein don't necessarily equate to adding muscle. You got to get under the squat rack or whatever mechanism you want to use to build muscle. So that's the big challenge. And I think this is the story of The Biggest Loser. They clearly went too fast and overshot.
Yep.
And it just became impossible to live a healthy life without gaining a lot of weight. And then there's frustration that kicks in because you're like, you know what? I'm eating 2,000 calories a day instead of 3,000. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week instead of 6 hours a day, every day, like I did during the show. And I'm gaining and gaining and gaining, and it sucks. And then I'm ordering a pizza or whatever, like we don't know what the psychology is at that point. But I think muscle building is the only thing that you can do to keep that metabolic rate up. We did the VO2 max test and the resting metabolic rate test on all of us. And using the Pnoe device was really just a great way to know what somebody's resting metabolic rate is. Your resting metabolic rate is the minimum number of calories you need to be awake and just sitting there in a day. And if you see that number over time dramatically drop, you better watch it, because now you're in a situation where it's an unwinnable situation. You will gain the weight back if that metabolic rate drops. The way to prevent that is to add muscle.
Yep. I love the emphasis on getting under the squat rack and adding muscle. That's why in my example there of the reverse dieter, I said our strategy would be to get them into the gym and working out as able. The challenge there as a trainer is when these people are on such low calorie diets, they don't have much energy. And so workouts are usually pretty, there's not much intensity and not much volume in the beginning. But that's the path that they have to start on, and it can increase over time. That's one of the main things. And then, like Dr. G said, getting their protein met, the protein needs met. That's a huge one. Someone on those low calorie diets, I mean, Josh, we've seen they're taking in 30 or 40 grams of protein a day sometimes, which barely enough to survive on, and if we want to start building muscle and get them out of this hole that they're in, they've got to be 100 grams plus, probably 150 grams or something like
guys,
that.
I do have to jump. I have to jump onto another call, but this is a great conversation, and I think it's worth continuing.
Yeah. Let's, obviously we're doing these frequently. Everyone's loving them. So Dr. G, quick shout out. How can listeners learn more about you?
Everything at Dr. Stephen G, for as far as all social media and YouTube and all that stuff. And then drsteveng.com, drsteveng.com.
Awesome. Thank you. And for everyone listening, co-movement.com, co-movement.com to learn more. Thank everyone for jumping on today. This is a great conversation. Andy and Dr. G, thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting our sponsors, Native Path Supplements, Lombardi Chiropractic, and A Dog's Day Out Doggy Daycare. They help us bring you 2 new episodes each month and have a special discount just for our listeners. See the show notes for more details. Thank you, and see you next time on the Co-Movement Gym Podcast.